All right, welcome back, everyone. So in this part, we're going to pick up and begin talking about specific motor pathways. So we're going to look at specific ways and specific tracks that our motor signals can travel. All right. So in general, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss two different types here. All right. One type is going to be called a direct or a pyramidal, and we've alluded to these in previous parts. So one is going to be called a direct or a pyramidal pathway. One is going to be called the indirect or extrapyramidal pathway. All right. So for our direct pathway, we are starting in the cerebrum. Right. We're starting in the cerebral cortex, generally the primary motor cortex. We're going down. We are stimulating skeletal muscle. There's a direct connection from our cortex down to our spinal cord, or a direct connection from our brain, from our cerebral cortex to our brainstem, depending on where the muscles are that we're going to innervate. So are the muscles in the head and neck? Are they on the arms? Are they in the legs? So on and so forth. This is going to be a pathway that we can voluntarily control. So when you decide to smile, you decide to turn your head, you decide to move your arm or legs, this is being controlled by the direct or pyramidal pathway. All right. We'll have the upper motor neurons synapse directly onto the lower motor neurons. And then remember, those lower motor neurons are what go out to the periphery and stimulate the effectors to be innervated, right? So a muscle in this case. Now, where the tracks are traveling is they're starting up at the brain, right? So we're starting up here. You go down through the brainstem, spinal cord, out to the effector. If we come over here, this is midbrain, pons, medulla, and these large kind of swellings here are called the pyramids, right? And the pyramids contain the descending tracks of one of these pathways called the corticospinal pathway, right? And we'll talk about it in more detail, but these pyramids, we'll kind of come back to these here in just a little bit. Now, the image in the upper left, you can see that you have these corticospinal tracts, right, that we'll see. These are part of the direct pathway or the pyramidal tract. You then have these extrapyramidal tracts that contain rubrospinal, reticulospinal, one called vestibulospinal, tectospinal. These are all indirect or extrapyramidal. We do not voluntarily control those, okay, and we'll get to those. So speaking of indirect or extrapyramidal, these have their upper motor neuron start or originate in a region other than the cerebral cortex. So largely they're starting in the brainstem somewhere, right? So if you look here, here is our pons, here's our medulla. So we're looking at brainstem, and then we're looking at spinal cord coming down, right? These go down, the upper motor neurons synapse with a lower motor neuron, and then again that lower motor neuron goes out to the periphery. However, these we do not have conscious control over. So these are happening at the subconscious level. These are largely helping to maintain balance, equilibrium, posture, things like that. Okay, so the pyramidal was voluntarily controlled, starting in the cerebral cortex. Extrapyramidal here, involuntarily controlled, subconscious, and largely we cannot control them, going to muscles for posture, balance, equilibrium, things like that. All right, so when we're looking at these, it is easy to understand, or it's easier to understand the kind of direction that these pathways are traveling or what they're going to just based on the name, right? So the name of these pathways will be corticospinal or tectospinal or reticulospinal or corticobulbar. There'll be all these different names. And if you understand the parts of the name, then you understand where it's coming from and where it's going, right? So take, for example, our corticospinal tract, right? The term cortico is referring to cortex, and this is referring to the cerebral cortex, right? So we're referring to this region up here, right? This region of gray matter, cerebral cortex, right? The term spinal, in this case, is referring to spinal cord, right? So we're starting in the cerebral cortex, and we're going down and we're ending, the upper motor neuron ends in the spinal cord, right? And then from the spinal cord, the lower motor neuron goes out and into the periphery, right? There's another one called the corticobulbar tract, all right? Starts in the cortex, goes to the bulb, which is referring to the brain stem, all right? You could do the same thing for the vestibulospinal, right? Vestibulo refers to vestibular, meaning balance and equilibrium. And so this has to do with our ear. And then spinal, again, going to the spinal cord. So that tract would be going from the ear, inner ear, to the spinal cord, brainstem, and then spinal cord, right? So if you look at these and you think about them in this way, it becomes a little bit easier to to understand their function, where the pathway is starting, and then where the pathway is ending. All right. So with that, we'll begin talking about some of these. All right. So the first one that we'll look at is called the corticospinal tract. All right. So again, cortex, spinal cord. These are stimulating our skeletal muscles voluntarily. All right. So we have voluntary control over these pathways. All right. Now we've mentioned in previous parts that many of our pathways undergo decussation. Okay, so decussation meaning they cross from one side to the other, right? So if you note here, we're starting on one side of the brain, right? So we're starting here, right side of the brain, and we go down and we're going to left side of the body, right? Here we're doing the same thing. We're starting on right side of the brain, go down, left side of the body, okay? So you decussate. Now, where that decussation occurs depends on the specific tract, right? And so we'll see that we have two different tracts for this corticospinal, and so you have two different areas where you decussate, all right? So this pathway, corticospinal, is sometimes called the anterolateral corticospinal tract, all right? Because you have an anterior division and a lateral division. The lateral division here, so this is our lateral division, this is what's going to come down and innervate the kind of distal part of our limbs, or the muscles that move the distal part of our limbs, right? So like forearm, hand, finger muscles, things like that, okay? The anterior is going to get more proximal and trunk muscles, right? So more of the muscles along the axial skeleton, okay? So with these lateral pathways, and the lateral is this one here on the left image. They'll come down, and in the brainstem, many of the fibers will cross over. They'll decussate in the brainstem and then descend on the contralateral side. Okay, contralateral meaning the opposite side, as opposed to ipsilateral meaning the same side. Right? So about 85% of these fibers that come down, roughly 85% cross over and become the lateral corticospinal tract. So note right here, lateral corticospinal tract coming down, right? The other 10 to 15% of the fibers that don't cross over, that don't decussate, become the anterior pathway, or the anterior tract, right? So follow these down, go through the brainstem, they do not decussate, continue, and then at the level of the spinal cord, with the lower motor neuron, then it decussates, and then it goes over to the opposite side, right? So if it crosses in the brainstem, that's going to make up the lateral tract. If it does not, it's going to make up the anterior tract here, okay? And again, lateral tract getting largely distal parts of the limb for muscles there, the anterior tract getting more proximal and trunk musculature, okay? So along with the corticospinal, you also have something called the corticobulbar, right? So cortico, again, we're starting in the cortex. Bulbar is referring to the bulb of the brain, right? And so this is referring to the brainstem, all right? And so with this pathway, these are going to, and think about the brainstem, where it is in relation to the skull and the face and things. These are going to then send upper motor neurons down to lower motor neurons. So again, here's our upper motor neuron with the corticobulbar tract, and then they send up onto these lower motor neurons, and these go out to muscles of the head, face, neck, things like that, right? So going to trigeminal nerve, facial nerve, so masticatory muscles, facial expression muscles, hypoglossal for the tongue muscles, vagus nerve for muscles in the larynx, maybe cranial nerve 11 for spinal accessory to move the shoulders, shrug the shoulders, turn the neck, or turn the head in the neck, things like that, right? So things that are associated with chewing, facial expression, tongue movement, swallowing, these are innervated by lower motor neurons that receive their stimulation from upper motor neurons in this corticobulbar tract, right? So hopefully this makes sense. And again, the term bulbar, again, it's referring to brainstem, all right? So there's a video here. If you have access to the notes, you can click on this video in the lower right and view a video on the corticobulbar tract if you want. So some more detail on the corticobulbar tract. So here you see our direct pathways, right? So we have our two corticospinal tracts that we discussed, and then you have the corticobulbar, right? So again, as a review, corticospinal, we're starting in the cortex, right? So all these start with corticospinal, corticobulbar, start in the cortex, right? We're ending in the spinal cord, right? So we go to the level of spinal cord. Bulbar means brainstem, so we're going to the pons, which is part of the brainstem. And then you can see where where those lower motor neurons are going, right? So here they're going to appendicular muscles, if we have the lateral corticospinal tract. Here they're going to more proximal axial skeletal muscles, if it's the anterior. And then here they're going to muscles in the face, mouth, head, neck region for chewing, facial expression, things like that, for the cortical bulbar tracts, right? So keep in mind all of these as we talk about them. So we'll finish this part by talking about two more tracts, and these are going to be called indirect pathways or extrapyramidal tracts, right? And these will be the vestibulospinal and the reticulospinal tract, right? So for our first one, vestibulospinal tract. Vestibulospinal tract, we said earlier that the term vestibulo is referring to vestibular, which means balance, equilibrium, posture, things like that. And so this is coming from the ear, right? The inner ear, right? Via cranial nerve 8, right? So we have the vestibular nucleus here in the pons. It receives its innervation that would be coming over here from the ear, coming in via cranial nerve 8. And from there, you go down and you give innervation to muscles of the head and neck for that control muscle tone, extension of the head, extension of the back and the arms for maintaining balance and for maintaining position. Right. So you have a lateral tract here, and you have a medial tract as well, right? So you can see here that you have a lateral nucleus, right, that gives rise to the lateral tract. You have a medial nucleus, gives rise to this medial vestibulospinal tract, right? So the upper motor neuron starts in the pons, right? We're starting here in the vestibular nucleus of the pons. That's what we're talking about right here. Vestibular nucleus of the medulla and pons, so we're starting right here. And then you go down, synapse with a lower motor neuron in the spinal cord associated with those particular muscles. So if it's going to the neck, it's for maybe some neck muscles to maintain the head position. If it's muscles in the arm, it's to help control the positioning of the arms to maintain balance. So maybe you move your arms out, something like that. And so that would be more for this lateral spinal tract that you see here, vestibulospinal. And then the medial is perhaps more muscles of the neck. So we're going to the region of the cervical spinal cord, right? So the region of the spinal cord will that the upper motor neuron goes to will largely determine where the lower motor neurons leave and then what muscles they go to innervate, right? So usually if you leave in the cervical spinal cord, you're going to muscles in the cervical region, so like head and neck muscles. If you leave in the lower part of the spinal cord, maybe you're going to muscles associated with the back or the arm or the leg or something like that. Okay, so this is vestibulospinal, coming in from the ear, cranial nerve 8, and then from there going to the pons, down the brainstem and spinal cord and the vestibulospinal tract, and then out to its effectors. Okay. Now, the last one that we'll talk about here with the indirect or extrapyramidal tracts is something called the reticulospinal tract. Right. So the reticulospinal tract is largely going to involve involuntarily controlling muscles, again, with posture and equilibrium and balance. And again, these are involuntarily controlled because these are part of our indirect or extrapyramidal pathway, right? So they also have some control over parts of the autonomic nervous system. But largely here, this last point, axial and proximal muscles, posture, locomotion, and muscle tone, all right? So with this, there are two kind of subtracts in the reticulospinal. There's one called the medial reticulospinal and one called the lateral reticulospinal. One involves the excitation of extensor muscles, and one results in the inhibition or the lack of excitation of extensor muscles, right? And so both of these help to maintain posture and balance when you're falling, you're walking on uneven pavement, walking on rocks that are not super steady, right? And you have to maintain balance. This pathway is sending information down to the muscles to cause contraction or relaxation in certain combinations that help you maintain your balance very nicely, okay? So again, reticulospinal and the previous vestibulospinal here, these are both indirect, extrapyramidal. We do not control them. And then the two that we talked about before that, the corticospinal and the corticobulbar, are both voluntary. They're both direct pyramidal pathways, and you do have control over them, right? So we'll end here with this part, and then we'll pick up in our next part talking about muscle tone and posture. We'll also talk a little bit about something called Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles as well.